Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on wherever you might be joining us from today. I'm greeting you from Berlin, Germany, and because it's already 2 p.m., I would like to welcome you to the third webinar of the Ambition Initiative call on frequently asked questions and clarifications. My name is Laura. I work at the Technical Support Unit of the NAMA facility, and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. I am joined today by a handful of colleagues, namely Ernesta, Juan David, Frankie, and Jasmine, who you will meet later on and who will guide us through the content of our presentation. And of course, by Alexandra and Radina, who are working in the back end to ensure the technical aspects of today's webinar run smoothly. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and uploaded on the NAMA facilities website. Your image or your voice will not appear on the recording since these functions are disabled for the entire duration of the webinar. Nevertheless, if you do not consent to the recording, you will not be able to participate in this webinar. Before I jump into the specifics, I would like to, first of all, thank you all on behalf of the TSU for your interest in the Ambition Initiative call of the NAMA facility. We are very excited to see such a high turnout of participation today. We currently have more than 80 participants and counting. So let's jump to the goals that we have for today. Firstly, we want to take a closer look at the NAMA facility's eligibility criteria for the Ambition Initiative call. Secondly, we want to take a deep dive into the selection criteria with a focus on business models and financial support mechanisms. And last but not least, we would like to provide you with a summary of some selected clarification requests we received in the past 4 rounds of clarifications. Moving on, let's take a closer look at the overall structure of the webinar. Today, as I just mentioned, we will have multiple colleagues leading us through the 5 parts we have envisioned for this webinar. First up is me, and I will walk you through the technical overview. Followed up by Jasmine and Frankie, who will guide us through the eligibility criteria of the Ambition Initiative call. Following will come Ernesta and Juan David with a deep dive on the selection criteria of the Ambition Initiative call, with a special focus on business cases, financial support mechanisms, and some recommendations. And finally, we will get back to Jasmine and Frankie for an overview of selected clarification requests. We will also hold a question and answer session at the end of the webinar, where we will address incoming questions. As time is limited, unfortunately, we will only be able to respond to a handful of questions. However, do not worry if we do not get to your question, because we will, as always, address all questions from today, regardless of whether we pick them up during the question and answer session as part of our upcoming clarification notes on the 28th of April. But before we jump into the core topics of today, I would like to make a couple of technical clarifications for your information. As you might have noticed, we are using MS Teams Live events today. All participants have been automatically muted. Therefore, you will not be able to interact directly into the webinar. You can, nevertheless, submit your questions, and I, as the moderator, will gather them and try to cover them later in our question and answer session. Please keep in mind, as I just mentioned, that all questions submitted today will also be covered in our upcoming clarification notes on the 7th of April. As you can see here on the slide, there is a tab that you can use to submit your questions. Additionally, there is another function I would like to draw your attention to, and that is that you can use live subtitles. These are available in English, Spanish, and French, and can help you follow today's webinar if needed. You can find the tab that will allow you to make use of these live subtitles on the upper left corner of your screen. With this, we can move to our first agenda item, and for that, I'm happy to hand over the word to my colleague Jasmine. Over to you, Jasmine.
Thank you very much, Laura, and hello everyone also from my side. My name is Jasmine and I will guide you through the next section of the webinar. As a first topic of today, we would like to revisit the eligibility criteria of the Ambition Initiative call. There are some obvious requirements like a timely submission of your application, the completeness of documents, which entails the main outline document and 6 annexes, of which 2 of them contain 2 separate documents, and also that all documents need to be provided in English. In addition, there are certain characteristics that an NSP needs to have in order to be eligible, and those include, for example, that NSPs need to have a detailed preparation phase of either 10 or 15 months. The implementation period should be between 3 and 5.5 years. NAMA facility funding should not be used for the generation of tradable GHG emission allowances in the compliance market, or in case they are generated, those allowances should be cancelled, and this needs to be indicated already at outline stage. The country of implementation must be listed on the OECD DAC list, and NSP funding and all associated investments must qualify as official development assistance throughout the complete implementation period of the NSP. And then lastly, the NSP must be additional. That means that NSPs are only eligible for funding if they can demonstrate their additionality to any ongoing or planned public or private intervention, and that includes both nationally or internationally funded initiatives. If you have already participated in our last webinars in January and in March, you're most probably already aware of some of the changes that were introduced with the Ambition Initiative call. Regarding the eligibility criteria, 2 aspects changed, and that is firstly, the upper funding volume was increased from previously 20 million euro to now 25 million euro. And secondly, countries need to have submitted an enhanced and ambitious NDC to the UNFCCC before the deadline of the Ambition Initiative call. Details on the definition of enhanced and ambitious NDCs can be found in the general information document of this call, and that is available on our website. And as we have received several clarification requests on the definition and on what qualifies as an enhanced and ambitious NDC, we decided to present to you some of those requests and zoom in a bit closer on this eligibility criterion. My colleague Frankie will support me on this part, and she will answer the questions that were raised by the NAMA facility community. So one question that we received for several countries is, since country XYZ has already submitted its first updated NDC to UNFCCC, does this NDC meet the definition of enhanced and ambitious as included in the general information document? Frankie, can you share with us the NAMA facility stance?
Hello, and my apologies. I had some problems with my mic there. But yes, of course. And first of all, hello, my name is Frankie. So the answer to your question, Yasmin, is that over the course of the Ambition Initiative call, the NAMA facility will not express its views on the level of ambition of individual enhanced NDCs and will abstain from commenting on the plans and timelines of individual countries with respect to the process of updating their NDCs. However, please note that in the webinar we held on the 24th of March this year, the TSU presented a fictional but more tangible example of enhanced and ambitious NDCs. And the recording of this webinar is available on our website.
Thank you, Frankie. Let's directly move to the next clarification request we received, and it reads, given that the NAMA facility funds are considered as ODA funds, does the NAMA facility assess only the ambition of a country's conditional NDC, or are the contributions in their totality assessed? And that means both unconditional and conditional contributions. Frankie, can you please share the NAMA facility's response?
Of course. So the NAMA facility will take into consideration the totality of the country's NDC, that is the unconditional and conditional contribution, in order to assess whether the definition of ambitious NDCs as specified in section 4.1 of the general information document, has been met.
Thank you, Frankie. Another question received is the following. How are NSP outlines treated from countries that already announced to submit an enhanced NDC in summer 2021, for example, in the run-up to COP26, but only after the closure of the Ambition Initiative call? Would a statement of intention of a partner country to submit the NDC update at a defined date suffice in this case? For example, as an attachment to Annex 1, which are the endorsement letters? Frankie, over to you.
Thanks for this question, Yasmin. And the NAMA facility's response would be that, as stated in our general information document, outlines of NSPs that plan to intervene in a country with an enhanced NDC submitted to the UNFCCC until the closure of the Ambition Initiative call on the 31st of May 2021 will be eligible to participate in this call. And for more information, have a look at our second clarification notes publication in section 11. A statement of intention of the partner country to submit the updated NDC at a certain date will thus not suffice for a country to be eligible. Please note that NSP outlines of countries whose NDC updates have been delayed due to the COVID-19 pandemic might be eligible under future calls of the Ambition Initiative if such rounds are launched. All related information will be published on the NAMA facility website in due course.
Thank you, Frankie. We have one last question, and I will read it out loud again. How decisive is a country's formulated NDC for the success chances of an outline? Frankie, again, over to you.
Thanks. The submission of an enhanced and ambitious NDC, according to the NAMA facility's definition, until the closure of the Ambition Initiative call, is one of the eligibility criteria of the call. In case a country's NDC meets this definition and the submission also complies with other eligibility criteria as described in the General Information Document, section 5.1.3, Outline Assessment Criteria, the likelihood of an outline success depends solely on the quality and context of the outline, including the submitted annexes.
Thank you very much, Frankie. That was pretty clear. As said in the beginning, please submit your questions in case there are any further so that we can pick them up later at the Q&A session or in the next clarification round. And with that, I already hand over back to Laura.
Thank you very much, Jasmine and Frankie. I believe this section already provided us with quite a clear picture on what the eligibility criteria of the Ambition Initiative call entails. Before we move on to the next agenda item, I just want to, once again, encourage all of our listeners to take a closer look at the clarifications we publish on our website on a monthly basis since the Ambition Initiative call opened. We recently published round number 4 on the 7th of April, and until the call closure, there will be 2 more rounds, one on the 20th of April and the other one on the 19th of May. So please take a moment to look at those, as they include several additional questions on the eligibility criteria, but also on other aspects of NSPs in general, also about the detailed preparation phase and many other features which might be interesting for you. With this, I would like to hand over the word to my colleagues Ernesta and Juan David for our next agenda item, a deep dive on the selection criteria of the Ambition Initiative call. Over to you, Ernesta and Juan David.
Thank you, Laura, and hi everyone from my side as well. So as you can see on this slide, next we will take a look at some of the selection criteria that we have at the NAMA facility. And namely, we will explore into greater depth what's behind the business cases, financial support mechanisms, and we will end with a few recommendations that we could offer at this point. So let's start with a bit of context setting for this discussion. I would like to point out that the aspects that we will present here, covering the business model and financial mechanisms, feature under two parts of the eligibility criteria. As you can see in this graph here, they are important for the financial ambition criteria and project design criteria under eligibility. So this is just a very quick overview, and you will find more information on this criteria on the general information document, which you can see linked on the slide here. So now let's dive into the business model discussion. Here at the NAMA facility, we consider the redirection of the flow of funds to be a key indicator for transformational change in a given sector. So you might ask, how does this redirection of the flow of funds happen? And we believe that to achieve this, the end user or investor decisions must be influenced towards carbon neutral pathway. And the underlying assumption here is that those end users or investors will change their commercial or financial decisions if it is economically beneficial for them and if it follows a potentially successful business model. Hence, such a business model needs to be elaborated as part of the NAMA facility outline submission. To put this in a bit more practical perspective, we have a very quick example of how a business case could look like. Please bear in mind that this will be a fictional example based on the fictional Totinia outline, which was developed by the TSU and which you can find on our website again. So this does not reflect any real-life setup or any preferences by the NAMA facility for funding activities. It just shows a fictional example. So in this Totinia country, the proposed setup is such that the generators are replaced with the new renewable energy generation. For example, the solar PV technology, as a lot of solar energy is available in this fictional country. The focus here is on large on-grid solutions, which are placed on commercial building rooftops, as the space is scarce in the islands of the fictional country of Totinia. The owners of these commercial buildings have shown interest in such interventions, as it provides not only stable electricity supply, but also shading and hence insulation benefits and savings. In this example, the PV panels are installed by the independent power producers, or IPPs in short, whereas the technology itself is imported as it's not available on the domestic market. The electricity is then sold to the utility and the IPP is compensated via the power purchase agreement. And in the next slide, you can see a simplified depiction of the business case I just described. So please take a moment to examine this illustration now. It essentially depicts the same example as before, clearly indicating the main actors involved, as well as the major flows of services or funds, which are depicted by the arrows. As you can see, this is, of course, a very simplified scheme used for illustration purposes. And as I've said, it's based on the fictional Totinia outline. So perhaps developing similar schemes at the initial phases of the business model compilation would be a good idea for you, simply to help determine the major actors and flows relevant for your business model. And next, moving forward, I will introduce you to a quick overview of the key components of the business model. So please bear in mind again that this is a rather simplified version, and we aim to cover some of the main questions to be answered when developing an outline for the business model elaboration. And here on the slide, you see the first three categories of business model components, namely technology, costs, and revenues. Right now, we will zoom in the technology component. And here, we would like a business case description to essentially list the key technical features. So for example, the electricity consumption, or the passenger capacity, or the number and species of trees to be planted per hectare. So it really depends on the type of technology you're dealing with in your local context. And in the fictional case we looked at before, this could be, for example, energy consumption per commercial building or something along those lines. The key here is that we basically need to know the main features of the proposed technology. And then the second point here under this component is the lifetime of that technology. Moving on to the costs component of the business model, we invite you to think about of course, the capital expenditure level as well as the operational expenditure level. We also invite you to estimate these two types of costs and provide us with the dynamics of them over time. So going back to the example again, this could be, let's say, how the PV prices could be estimated to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Again, just as an example for illustration purposes. Moving on to the revenues, we basically suggest to think what direct income can be generated through the technology or intervention. And here, for example, could be the cash flow that the IPP obtained through the sales of electricity to the utility in the fictional example we used before. In addition to that, we also highly encourage you to think of what cost savings could be available. So in our example, this was the savings the commercial building owners could obtain due to shading provided by the PV panel. And that would also potentially enter the business model cash flow. So think about both of these aspects. And in addition, we would encourage you to think, let's say, how could this change over time? Let's move on to the three more components of the business case. And here we have the key actors. So again, please reflect on who is involved, let's say, in the proposed intervention. So who would be the investor? Who would be the end user? And I would like to point out here that they do not always match. So the end user might be different than the investor, as we saw in our example as well, where we could consider that the IPPs could be the main investor, for example, whereas the building owners could be seen as the end user of the product, which was electricity in that case. And the third point here that's also crucial is to think about what is the ability and interest to pay, as well as how could that change over time. Moving on to the market, which is the fifth component of the business case. We would invite you to cover such aspects as, for example, who are the potential suppliers of the given technology? Where are these potential suppliers? And here we would think about, okay, are they available on the domestic market, or would these rather be international suppliers? Then likewise, who are the potential operation and maintenance providers? Additionally, please take a moment to reflect on what market developments could be expected in the future. So that would be quite important as well. And the last aspect under the business case, which we would like to point out, is that we would like to see the end-of-life considerations reflected in the business model. So for example, what happens once the technology reaches its end of life? What economic activities would need to take place? What additional costs or benefits are associated with that? Again, in our example above, this would mean specifying activities related to waste of the solar PV panels, for example. So this was a snapshot of the key components of a business case that we would like to see reflected as part of your outline submission. And moving on, I would like to mention some of the key considerations by the NAMA facility when it comes to this business model, which are a bit more overarching. So please, first, please bear in mind that the business model needs to be shown for both the business as usual as well as the NSP intervention. Next, please consider the key actor constellations relevant for your sector and context. So bear in mind, again, this distinction between investor and end user that we looked at just a few minutes ago. Then please explain your assumptions, clearly indicating the sources of those assumptions as well as the data that you use. We would also encourage you to use multiple scenarios, hence perform sensitivity analysis. And overall, your business model needs to demonstrate plausibility and potential for influencing the shift in the investment and financial decisions of the end users or investors towards low carbon pathway, as I've mentioned right in the beginning. And for the last slide on the business case part, I would like to quickly hint at the relationship between the business case and financial support mechanism. So here on the slide, I have a quote from the general information document. And it basically says that the concept of NSP needs to offer a potentially successful business model for end users or investors, including adequate financing mechanism. So as you can see from the quote here, the financial mechanism actually enters and influences the cash flows of the business case. And in fact, it contributes to making the business case for the NSP intervention viable. And now, of course, you might ask, okay, so why would the business case not be viable? And the answer would be because of certain barriers that might be in place. However, I will stop now and I will pass it on to my colleague Juan David, who will talk more about these barriers and about the financial mechanisms. So yes, Juan David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ernesta. That is correct. I will now be guiding you through the key features of financial support mechanisms under the NAMA facility, especially under the Ambition Initiative call. I want to start by sharing with you the understanding of the NAMA facility of what financial support mechanisms are. Financial mechanisms channel financial flows into investment that drive carbon neutral development pathways. They should be used to address the barriers and market failures for investment and also leverage public and private support. In the next slides, I will share with you the features that a well-rounded financial mechanism will have as part of an NSP. Remember, these features and considerations are valid for the NAMA facility and might differ from those of other programs. The first feature relates to the relevance and suitability of the financial mechanism, as well as that of the NSP. We want to see relevant barriers for investment being removed or at least significantly reduced with the support of the NSP. We look at what other alternative financial mechanisms were considered and the reason why they were discarded. We analyze separately the country and sector context of each NSP to understand how it fits into the existing regulation, policies, and other schemes that might be in place, and whether they will incentivize or disincentivize investment supported by the NSP, particularly in the long term. We also look at how suitable the financial mechanism is towards making the business model viable for the different target groups. Remember that the underlying assumption is that end users and investors will change their commercial and financial decisions if it is economically beneficial for them. Therefore, a suitable financial mechanism should enable this change. A scale and permanence of the financial mechanism is very important for the NAMA facility. We would like to see that the financial mechanism, together with financial assistance, will lead to a scaling up beyond the NSP and the NAMA facility funding, of course. At this point, we also question whether the financial flows and investment decisions will be permanently redirected or reversed, or whether there is a clear chance that they will revert to old business as usual patterns after the completion of the NSP. As part of our assessment, we also look for indications that the NSP will manage to permanently eliminate the barriers within its scope. In the event that a complete elimination is not possible within the lifetime and the scope of the NSP, a viable concept for the phase-out of the NAMA facility support that is linked to the phase-in of other sources of funding, such as public budgets, environmental fees, or taxes, is strongly advised. Accordingly, in the next criterion, financial leverage, we want to understand how the financial mechanism will mobilize additional private and public finance, especially during the implementation of the NSP, and what will be the extent or size of such mobilization of funds. We expect an NSP to have financial contributions from local or national sources, or even international sources, if that's the case. and all these contributions should be reflected in the overall budget of the NSP and prove the optimization of the co-funding provided by the NAMO facility. Please keep in mind that the contributions from the target groups or beneficiaries can be accounted here, and they will also positively reflect buy-in and ownership from the provision of services and technologies that were to be promoted by the NSP. We also look at the level of commitment of the co-funding or contributions that are expected to leverage financing. It is important for us to understand whether commitment to a specific level of funding is already secured, or whether the decision of committing these funds will only be done later during the implementation of the NSP. Based on our experience, we encourage applicants to seek for confirmation of contributions and for the availability of those contributions at an early stage of the NSP. In this context of financial leverage, it is also important for the NAMO facility to understand how the investor will access the financial mechanism and whether barriers for accessing financing will be effectively removed or not. It is worth noting that it is expected that access to financial mechanisms to be equal and open to all potential subjects of a target group. And rounding up the feature of financial leverage, we have the level of concessionality, where we look at its appropriateness in the country and sector context. And contrary to other funding programs, the NAMO facility does not have a predefined guideline or benchmark for the concessionality of a financial mechanism, but we do pay attention to any unintended effects, such as market distortion. For our last main feature, we look to understand how feasible and ready the financial mechanism is for its implementation. Here we do have a benchmark that indicates that the implementation of the financial mechanism should start within the first 18 months of the NSP implementation. This means no later than 6 months after the beginning of implementation phase 2. This will conclude the main features of our financial mechanism under an NSP of the NAMO facility. However, in my last slide for this topic, I want to present you with some additional features that could help you preparing an NSP outline. We are interested in knowing if your financial mechanism has integrated lessons learned from similar programs or pilot projects, even if those were not implemented in the same country of the NSP. Here we are looking at proof that the concept on which the financial support mechanism is based on, how it has evolved through experience, and it is now ready to effectively tackle the barriers and market failures that were identified. As it is the case with the NSP in general, the financial mechanism must be capable of proving its additionality to other existing or coming initiatives, which should be reflected in a sound market analysis. And last but not least, and in relation to the previous point, an NSP and its financial mechanism must avoid creating any unintended market distortions and crowding out of private sector and capital for investment. The goal of the NAMO facility is to actually crowd in the private sector whenever it's possible, and to enable the private sector to develop business for mitigation actions. In the next slide, we will take a look at how the NSP submitted by Totinia fares against the selection criteria in regard to its financial ambition and financial support mechanism. But first, let us review the relevant key facts of this NSP. As financial support mechanisms, Totinia is proposing a partial guarantee for partial payments to the independent power producers, a concessional loan with reduced interest rates, and a one-time subsidy that will trigger an additional investment from Totinia's Ministry of Finance. Regarding the financial ambition, we can see that this NSP has requested a total of 21 million euros to the NAMO facility, and it envisions a contribution from Totinia's national budget of 25 million. The participation of the private sector will amount to 72 million, while other donors will provide a total of 40.5 million euros. In total, the financial support mechanism of this NSP will mobilize over 136 million euros. Please remember that this is a fictional case and it is used for illustration purposes only. With this information at hand, we can now move forward with assessing how the selection criteria reflects on this NSP. The first criterion is the removal of financial or economic market barriers for failures. Totinia's NSPs offer a clear understanding on how these barriers or failures were identified, as they come up in the results of a market analysis and other sectoral studies previously done. Ideally, any market analysis done will have covered both the supply and the demand sides. Furthermore, this NSP uses a combination of financial mechanisms and regulatory reforms to tackle the barriers for investment to enable new opportunities for investment, especially from the private sector beyond the NSP lifetime. The second criterion is significant participation of the private sector in the financial component. For Totinia's NSP, the private sector is expected to participate with 72 of the total 157.5 million euros required to carry out the project, which will include a mix of commercial loans provided by local banks and equity provided by investors. As part of the application documents, the involved commercial banks and Totinia's pension fund provided letter of interest as proof of their commitment for their participation. This is a good moment to reiterate that every financial leverage is assessed relatively to the sector and the country of the NSP. The next criterion is very similar to the previous one, and it is the significant contribution of public budget. Here, the level of commitment to providing funds to the NSP that stem from a national or regional budget is considered. And the government of Totinia has committed a total of 24 million euros to the NSP, and it has outlined this commitment as part of the letter of endorsement from the Ministry of Finance that were provided with the application documents. I want to highlight that although as part of the assessment process, a greater weight is given to the public funds effectively mobilized, the country context is taken into consideration, and countries that cannot effectively provide funds will not be penalized for it. And last but not least, we find the criterion of participation of other financiers, possibly development financiers, where we look at the same topics as is the case of the public contributions. Here, it is worth mentioning that as part of its NSP, Totinia will use a contribution from its national budget of 7 million euros to leverage the participation of the Pink Climate Fund that will amount to over 20 million euros. So, as you can see, under the selection criteria of the NAMA facility, Totinia's NSP is considered as financially ambitious, and it has also provided sufficient proof of a relatively high level of secureness of financial contributions, both from the private and public sector, as well as from other development financiers. And with this, I will conclude this topic of today's agenda, and will give the floor back to Ernesta, who will share some key recommendations for the development of business models and financial mechanisms. Back to you, Ernesta.
Thank you, Juan. That was a very informative session. Yes, and here now we have the last part of this section of the webinar. In the next couple of minutes, I will basically give an overview of some of the recommendations that we have formulated at the NAMA facility for both the business case and the financial mechanism development. So here on the slide, you see a few bullet points that cover the recommendations for the business cases. First of all, we would like to invite you to basically realistically consider the needs, the vested interests, behaviors, economic conditions, and choices of various target groups that are relevant for your outline. As a second point, we would encourage you to use market studies and stakeholder interviews to substantiate the NSP business case. You can use it as potential data sources. Third, please remain realistic with respect to the risks of default or non-payment of fees or taxes that the NSP business case depends on. This is very important, and it relates to the second, to the aspect that I've touched on before concerning the key actor ability and interest to pay. And then lastly, remain realistic in terms of the time needed to implement reforms, particularly if we're talking about fiscal reforms, as those tend to take time. Now, let's move on to the recommendations for the financial mechanism development. And here we have the point on basically focusing on scalable financial mechanisms that can kickstart the market for the mitigation technology or practice, as well as lead to long-term sustainability. Please also focus on how the financial support mechanism is appropriate for overcoming the barriers identified during the barrier analysis, and ensure a clear causal link between the barriers identified and the financial mechanism proposed. Then please analyze the financing needs of both the demand and supply side of technology when designing the financial support mechanism. And lastly, keep in mind the bureaucratic hurdles and delays related to the setup of the financial mechanism, and please make sure to involve relevant stakeholders early on. So those would be the key recommendations from our side. And as the last point, the very last point under this section, I would like to briefly mention that we have this Annex 5, exactly on this, on business case and financial mechanism, which is actually a part of our outline submission documents. And as you can see, it's actually split into two parts. So we have Annex 5A that covers essentially 3 points. So description of the technology or practice and market. Then we have the description of the current business as usual financing parameters for the investor and end user, and the description of the proposed financial support mechanism. And then we have the Annex 5B, which basically includes analysis of different scenarios, and that would basically demonstrate that you perform the sensitivity analysis. So all this information that we use today in the webinar is actually relies heavily on this Annex 5. And I would also like to point out that we have a couple of more resources that could help you navigate through this. So first of all, we have the NAMA Facility podcast specifically on this Annex 5. And then secondly, we have the do's and don'ts document, which has been recently published on our website. So I would highly recommend taking a look at those, and we will link those documents in this presentation as well. So that would be all in this part of the webinar. And now I will give the floor back to Laura to introduce us to what's coming next.
Thank you, Ernesto and Juan David, for a very comprehensive explanation of how the selection criteria of the Ambition Initiative Call works. Now, let's get back to Jasmine and Frankie for our fourth agenda item, overview of selected clarification requests. Over to you, Jasmine and Frankie.
Thank you, Laura. As a next agenda point, we want to present to you the content of some recurrent questions that we received in the past clarification rounds. And while at the beginning of this webinar, the focus was on the eligibility criteria, for this agenda item now we want to focus on some of the implementation aspects that are new to the Ambition Initiative call. And I'm going to start with a new feature of NSP's focusing on novel technologies. A lot of questions were received that asked about additional information on the phased approach will work, or at what point in time the shift to the large-scale project needs to be achieved, or even if the focus on pilot technologies is now mandatory in this ongoing call. In the box on the right-hand side, we listed for you all related clarification requests that were answered so far. And also we provided a link in the box that brings you to the recording of the last webinar from March, in which we presented a fictional example on how an NSP outlined that pilots in innovative technology could be structured. And I will now share with you a summary of those answers that were provided by the NAMA facility on the aspects of pilots. So first of all, it is not mandatory for NSPs to focus on innovation and novel technologies. We have this option now to include a small-sized pilot for cases where an NSP focuses on novel technologies, but similar to the previous calls, proven technologies remain in focus of the NAMA facility as well. Piloting an established technology in a new setting or a new context would not be considered as innovative by the NAMA facility. And as the technology is considered to be mature, such an NSP would also not be eligible to have a small-sized pilot before it then moves into the larger scale project phase. The NAMA facility does not define a timeline that dictates the transition from pilot phase to large-scale project phase. And we also do not strictly limit the length of the pilot phase, but it would still be desirable to accomplish the shift to the large-scale project within the NSP's lifetime. And as I said, just in the beginning of the webinar, that means a maximum of 5.5 years. We were also asked if there will be additional decision points before moving to the large-scale project. And the answer to that is yes. The achievement of agreed milestones and criteria defined for the pilot phase will be a requirement before an NSP can transition to the large-scale project. And already in the NSP outlines, applicants should formulate key milestones that are associated with the pilot phase. And those would then need to be further specified at a later stage. Additional criteria might even be added by the NAMA facility board, so that with the entrance into implementation, a full set of milestones was defined, and that needs to be achieved before moving to the large-scale project phase. As additional guidance on how to fill in the outline template and the annexes, the NAMA facility has shared the following. The narrative of the outline, including the annexes, should always focus on the entire NSP. That means on both phases, pilot phase and the shift to the larger scale project. And for all information that is provided, the applicant should clearly delineate between those two phases. And then as a last point, the budget that needs to be indicated in outline section 4 should include the budget for both phases. And this could, for example, be done by just copy pasting the table and completing it once for the pilot phase and then a second time for the large scale project phase. We will now continue to some aspects on green recovery. And for that, I hand over to my colleague, Frankie.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So one of the assessment criteria to evaluate an NSP's ambition is its potential for transformational change. And as part of this criteria, we also assess the NSP's embeddedness in national strategies and its connection to national measures promoting a green recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, in the box on the right, you can see the related clarification requests that have been answered so far. On the topic of green recovery, there are only 2, and I'll offer you a summary of them now. First of all, we were asked if it's mandatory to cover the topic of green recovery in the outline, even in cases where a country has not formulated green recovery plans as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what we answered is yes. Even if no official green recovery plan has been formulated, the topic should be covered. This could be done, for example, by explaining which individual measures have been developed in the country to mitigate the pandemic's negative impacts, whether some of these measures can be considered green, and how the NSP can contribute to a wider uptake of green solutions to build back economies and sustain growth during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. This should also be covered in instances where no holistic green recovery plans or strategies are available so far. In the Ambition Initiative call, the NAMA facility also introduced an additional mandatory core indicator, You might remember that NSPs are usually required to report on only 5 mandatory core indicators, which are the greenhouse gas mitigation achieved, people benefiting from the NSP, the level of triggered transformational change, as well as the public and private financial leverage achieved. To monitor the NSP's impact during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, all NSPs are now asked to monitor and report on the mandatory core indicator N6, which tracks the contribution of the NSP to the country's measures to promote green recovery from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is also mandatory, irrespective of whether countries have formulated green recovery plans or not. As a second question, we will also ask how the NAMA facility will evaluate whether the green recovery plans of targeted countries are actually green. The response to that is that the overall quality of the recovery plans of individual countries and whether they can be considered green in their totality will not be part of the NAMA facility outline assessment. What we will assess, though, is whether the proposed NSP's activities contribute to a green recovery from the impacts of the pandemic via support to SMEs, job creation, gender mainstreaming, and so on, as part of the NSP's contribution to climate change mitigation. And that brings us to the last aspect we want to cover today, which is the NDC partnership. And for that, I'll hand over to Yasmin again.
Thank you, Frankie. Similar to the alignment with the country's green recovery plans, one of the assessment criteria to evaluate an NSP's potential for transformational change is also its alignment with the partnership plans of the NDC partnership. You know it already by now. In the box on the right-hand side, we listed the related clarification requests that were answered so far. And again, I'm summarizing for you the most relevant aspects. So first of all, a participation in the NDC partnership is no prerequisite for being eligible in the Ambition Initiative call. However, if a country is a member of the NDC partnership, the NSP needs to demonstrate a high level of alignment with the partnership plans that were developed through the NDCP. Should a country propose an NSP in a sector that is not yet covered by the NDC partnership plan, but is explicitly mentioned in the country's NDC, this lack of an alignment between the NSP and the partnership plan will not negatively impact the assessment of an NSP outline. In countries where economic advisors have been deployed with support from the NDCP, it is also highly recommended to link the NSP with the work of those advisors. And lastly, if you want to find out which country is part of the NDC partnership, you should refer to the website of the NDC partnership for further information. This was a brief overview of selected clarification requests related to some new aspects of the Ambition Initiative call. And with this, I give back to Laura.
We are experiencing a little bit of technical issues. Please bear with us for a moment while we solve them. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
Sorry, a small glitch on my side. Indeed, thank you, Jasmine, for sharing those insights with us. Because we have some time left, I would like to take the opportunity to go through some questions that we have been receiving from our attendees in the meantime. So let's start with that. The first question we received is the following. Is it permissible for the financial support mechanisms to evolve during the NSP implementation? For example, starting at pilot scale and being refined for scale-up and post-NSP continuity? This seems like a good question for Juan David. Juan David, could you please answer it?
Thank you, Laura. This is indeed a very interesting question. The NAMA facility does accept this approach. However, the applicant should bear in mind the lead times for the implementation of financial instruments and the maximum NSP implementation period, that is 5.5 years. And of course, the risk of a shortened window of opportunity that is inherent in such mechanisms to achieve the direct mitigation effects that are expected within the NSP implementation phase. Those are the main remarks to take into consideration for this case. I will give the word back to you, Laura.
Thank you for your answer, Juan. Our next question is there any minimum ratio for the financial leverage, for example, between the requested grant from the NAMA facility and the mobilized public and private finance? Again, Juan David, I think you would be best suited to answer this question.
Thank you, Laura. The NAMA facility does not request a minimum ratio for the financial leverage. However, during the assessment of the NSP outlines, the leverage ratio is taken into consideration in the country and the sector that is specific to the NSP, and of course the context in which they are both part of. As a reference, I can tell you that NSPs that have been selected in previous calls have proposed an average financial average ratio of 1 to 7, meaning that each euro of NAMA facility funding provided to the NSP is mobilizing or has mobilized further 7 euros in additional investments. And I think that that will be the short answer to this question. And back to you, Laura.
Thanks a lot, Juan, for your answer. And looking at the time, I think it's best for us to close our question and answer session now. And with that, we can already come to the last item of today, and those are the central documents and information sources we would like to draw your attention to. And for this, we have included this slide to highlight the different resources that are available in the NAMA facility website. As a golden recommendation, we would like to encourage all of our applicants to please familiarize themselves with the general information document and the application documents for the Ambition Initiative call. And of course, to take a deeper dive into different topics by revisiting past webinars on topics such as financial mechanisms and greenhouse gas mitigation potential. We also have many documents that provide details on key topics such as, for example, the NAMA facility's definition of transformational change, and of course, our clarification notes and frequently asked questions, which you have heard a lot during this webinar. And with this, we want to take a moment to thank you again for being with us today on the third and last webinar of the Ambition Initiative call. Please keep in mind that there will be 2 additional rounds of clarification notes, one in April and one in May. So please feel free to send us all your clarification requests in case there are any unanswered questions left. We're looking forward to your submissions by the 31st of May of this year. All the best and lots of success from your TSU team. Thank you for being with us here. Bye-bye.